Everyone, welcome to our review of the National Framework for Reducing and Eliminating the Use of Restrictive Practices in the Disability Service Sector. So here in Australia, we have a bit of a problem with the use of restrictive practices in both our education system and within our private sector and public sector disability services, with some more extreme instances coming up in the media over the last couple of years. These few examples, I think, are from mainly 2016, 2017, but instances of restrictive practices like cages and locked rooms being used when more severe instances of challenging behaviour come up, and I guess is really reflective of both just a lack of understanding and professionals with a skill set that allow for really respectful intervention on challenging behaviours, but also I guess gives us a bit of an indication of around what's been deemed acceptable within our sector, and the fact that those things that are currently considered acceptable or have been considered acceptable are problematic and need some more guidance around making sure that these things don't continue to happen, and that we get to a place where there's consensus that these sorts of interventions are not acceptable for use. So the National Framework for Reducing and Eliminating the Use of Restrictive Practices hopes to provide some more information, some objectives and goals, and some information about how we're going to get there in terms of really significantly reducing and hopefully overall eliminating the use of these restrictive practices. Within the guidelines, there are three kind of key areas that they really focus on, which is the idea that autonomy, dignity, oh my gosh guys, my words today, autonomy, dignity and respect should be a consideration for all of the stakeholders within any given situation. And this is really nice, and these things are really reflected within our professional and ethical compliance code as behaviour analysts. So this really sits nice and closely in line with who we are and what we want as well, which is really great. And just as a kind of a little side note, the aim of this framework is that it will continually and ongoingly work hand in hand with the NDIS, so the National Disability Insurance Scheme, going into the future, in ensuring that those professions and those service providers that are accessing funding through the NDIS and who are readily available to individuals hoping to receive support through the NDIS are in line with this national framework and are in compliance with those areas outlined as important within it. So a couple of definitions here to help us as we work through the framework and make sure that we're all on the same page and have the same understanding of the different kinds of restraint and restrictive practices that exist. So when we're talking about physical restraint, we're talking about the use of physical force to prevent, restrict or subdue the movement of a person's body or part of their body. So those individuals are not free to move away when they are being physically restrained. So this might be use of safe manual handling and those sorts of things, or any time where you are putting your hands onto another person to change the way that they are moving within their environment. Manual restraint refers to mechanical restraint, which is the use of a device to prevent or restrict a person's movement with the primary purpose of influencing that person's behaviour. So this might be if cuffing or strapping was used to a person's hands or feet to stop their free movement within an environment. It could be things to like if you think about those leashes that sometimes parents use with their children, those sorts of things could be considered a mechanical restraint, manual restraint, because they influence that person's behaviour and their ability to move within their environment. And chemical restraints refer to any medication primarily used to control or subdue behaviour and which is not being used to treat an underlying physical or mental illness or physical condition. So it's any time where any kind of medication or chemical is being used to decrease behaviour and not in a therapeutic way, but in a management format. And within these things, these should all be reported if they ever come up or if you ever come into contact with them. We need to keep a record of these kinds of restraint being used. The national framework also outlines psychosocial and environmental restraint as existing. So psychosocial refers to that power imbalance and the use of status to control the behaviour of another person. And environmental refers to the restriction of a person's free access to all parts of the environment. We also have a definition of seclusion, which is any time where a person is confined into an area or into a room and their exit is barred. And this could be by a physical barrier, so maybe a gate or a door, or another person standing in the way of the exit and using their physical presence to block exit from that area. This might also include situations where an individual is left in a room or an area and reasonably believes that they cannot leave. So even if they physically can leave, even if the door is not locked, if there is an understanding of certain consequences or the perception that I can't leave, then that counts as seclusion as well. There's a little note here stating that this doesn't include timeout or use of a safe space or chill out rooms, or refer to situations that are like in school suspensions or detentions or exam situations. And a little note on, in the vast majority of cases, the only time a student should be locked in a room on their own in response to behaviours that cause harm to self or others, and when that room has been evacuated, leaving the student alone. So just some kind of guidelines around those sorts of things that come from our education department, but that also apply to these same ideas within general disability service sector. And so the national framework works beneath an overarching set of guiding principles that relate to the UN's Code of Human Rights. And so this is around the full and equal enjoyment of human rights as fundamental and fundamental freedoms that people with a disability should have the same access to without any kind of discrimination, in the same way that able-bodied people are able to have those same fundamental freedoms. There should be no discrimination there. And these include things like respect for dignity, an individual autonomy, being able to make your own choices, equity in front of the law, freedom from torture or degrading treatment, which is one that is worth really mentioning, liberty and security, respect for physical and mental integrity, freedom from abuse or violence, personal mobility, freedom of expression. All of these things come within the Code of Human Rights. The other principles that underlie the national framework are having a person-centred focus, the approach being nationwide. So at the moment, there is a little bit of state-by-state kind of governing going on, and what we're looking for is that across the whole of Australia we have one consistent approach. We're also aiming for quality outcomes, for safe workspaces, so for both the individuals and for professionals practicing within this space, that there is accountability, there's documentation, we set benchmarks, we evaluate the success or the lack thereof. That concept of collaboration across multiple different service providers, across funding bodies like the NDIS, all of those sorts of things, and that there's ongoing education available about restrictive practices to anybody that this might be relevant to, and general, open discussion about that, because the only way that we change people's behaviour is by generating that education and understanding of and rationale development as to why it's important that we don't do these things and how we can choose alternatives that provide equally acceptable outcomes. So there are 6 core strategies for reducing restrictive practices that are outlined within the national framework. And these are, again, that person-centred focus, which we'll talk more about in a minute, leadership towards organisational change, the use of data to inform practices, my personal favourite, workforce development, use within disability services of restraint and seclusion reduction tools, so that tool development and use, and debriefing and practice review. So the first of the 6 core principles that we're going to talk about is that idea of person-centred focus. And so this means including the perspectives of people with a disability and their support networks when we are debriefing about behaviour that has occurred or any instances where restrictive practices have been in play. When we're talking about intervention design, both in an individual and at a state or nationwide approach, in that education and training and those opportunities, and in policy and practice development. And so that person-centred focus means that we are acknowledging that people with a disability have the right and should have the autonomy to be active members within this space, and that there should be a consultation and real genuine seeking of input from individuals in regards to those matters that impact on them. And the key implementation areas that are outlined within the national framework are that the development and regular review of individual behaviour support plans that are based on valid evidence-based risk assessments in conjunction with people with disability and their guardians or advocates where appropriate, as active participants in discussions about their lives, support and care. And this is really great, again, really fits closely with our professional and ethical compliance code and our values as behaviour analysts. It's looking at making sure that the tools that we're using are evidence-based, that we're using assessment to help guide our use and development of behaviour interventions, that we are seeking consent, and that we are making sure that we are informing everybody that is working within this space of the plan, and making sure that everybody's on board with it, and really individualising and considering the individual within the creation of behaviour change programming. The second key implementation area is development and use of appropriate individualised behavioural and environmental risk assessment tools by disability service providers, which are in line with human rights and person-centred approaches. So looking proactively at what environmental and behavioural risks there are and the likelihood of these things coming up, and developing strategies that can be implemented to both decrease the likelihood of these behaviours coming into play, and also reactive strategies for what happens if this does come up, and how are we going to get ourselves out of that situation in a way that's acceptable to everybody involved, and that is showing that dignity and respect to the individual whose behaviour is being changed. Development of individualised and evidence-based practices, such as teaching the use of replacement skills. So that fair pair idea that we've talked about in the past, where if you're decreasing one behaviour, you are increasing a functionally equivalent behaviour that is socially acceptable to ensure that that person's needs are still being met. Based on the principles of positive behaviour support, and as we know, PBS, ABA, closely interrelated, built on those same behavioural principles. and availability of tools to assist people with disability and their guardians or advocates to participate in decision making. So this could be looking at strategies that will make communication about behaviour change programs clearer and more accessible to those individuals who are needing to make decisions about their behaviour or about the behaviour of a loved one, and how to ensure that restrictive practices aren't coming into play there. The second of the 6 key principles within the national framework is leadership towards organisational change. And there is acknowledgement here that this isn't just on senior management. This is a holistic approach where everybody at every level needs to prioritise the reduction of restrictive practices and needs to be developing the skill set and the understanding to make sure that those practices aren't relied upon in instances of challenging behaviour. So senior management and leaders within disability services must prioritise the reduction of restrictive practices, so make that a real goal and make it known that that's a goal within the service provision, and must develop tools and opportunities for staff. So acknowledging that we need to upskill the people working within this sector at understanding what is restrictive, when are the times where we're being restrictive, what strategies can we use to make sure that that's not happening. So the key implementation areas here are leaders at all levels across government and the non-government sector commit to implement reduction in the use of restrictive practices. So making that commitment, making it known, and doing that at a leadership level. Governments provide strategic direction to disability service providers. Disability service providers form relevant governance structures and groups to provide organisational support mechanisms aimed at reducing restrictive practices. So having bodies that you can refer to or get information from about how to decrease the use of those restrictive practices. And clear and transparent mechanisms for disability representatives and stakeholders to inform policymakers on practices and guidelines. So this is setting up ways for the individuals that are most going to be impacted on by the use of restrictive practices to be a part of changing our policies and practices and getting involved and having input into the way that we want things to look in the future and how we're going to get there, and outcomes that should be expected as a result of this. The third of the principles is the use of data to perform practices, which is excellent. This is something that we as behaviour analysts have a real strength in. We're a data-informed practice. We are really great at looking at data to see whether something is effective and changing. So this here relates to data being required to monitor whether or not behaviour is effectively being changed and to monitor the use of restrictive practice. So looking at when are the times where restrictive practice is used, what are some of those common antecedents for the use of restrictive practice, what environments are we often using restrictive practices in, how can we review that data, see when that's coming up and make changes to decrease the likelihood of it being used, as well as looking at what interventions are being used as behaviour change tools and are they effectively changing behaviour, or do we need to look at different ways to do things. So the key implementation areas for this are that collection of data at a service unit or organisational level to inform and improve future practice and contribute to national data collection. So making sure that service providers are engaging with data collection procedures and are keeping on top of logging and recording when restrictive practices have been used and when restrictive practice hasn't been used, and whether these practices are effective in managing behaviour. identification of baseline data to be collected, so making sure we know where we're at before we work out whether or not what we've changed is being successful, and the ability to set improvement and performance targets and evidence to how this will be used to reduce reliance on restrictive practices. Development and maintenance of an auditing tool to evaluate the use of restrictive practices, including the frequency with which they are used. The tool should have capacity to feedback into the support of people with disability, including into risk assessments and service review, preferably integrated with disability service provider staffing and management systems. So we need to be collecting data that is meaningful in a way that allows us to keep track of when restrictive practices are being used and consequate that effectively. Collection of and measuring outcomes through feedback from people with a disability and staff about their experiences with restrictive practices within the disability service. So talking to the people that matter about their experiences and making sure, again, that the data we're collecting is worthwhile data, that the data that we're collecting is reflective of the experiences of the individuals where it is socially significant, and that we're talking to the people that matter. Make use of data on formal complaints or reviews about the use of restrictive practices in disability services made through existing complaint or review mechanisms, such as ombudsman or tribunal, or through new mechanisms that may become available through the NDIS where appropriate. So referring information on. Next up, we have workforce development. And there was a lovely little quote in this that I've just popped in here. There is good evidence to show that disability support staff who understand positive behaviour support, functional behaviour assessment, as well as a focus on skills for trauma-informed care, risk assessment, de-escalation and restrictive practice alternatives are able to provide good support and reduce the use of restrictive practices to people who have complex needs. So information is power, understanding is power, knowing what you know and what you don't know makes a difference to the way that people practice, and decreases that likelihood of restrictive practices being used. And this is something that all of you are learning right now, is this idea of functional behaviour assessment and positive behaviour support, and knowing how to de-escalate a situation and assess for risk. And by having more individuals that are really skilled in doing these things, we go out into the world and we decrease the likelihood of these practices being used, because we understand that there are different and more effective ways of doing these things with better outcomes for everybody involved. So the key implementation areas here are promoting the use of interdisciplinary approaches towards assessment, intervention and individual behaviour support plans. So talking amongst one another, finding out who's doing what and how, and using those evidence-based systems to make sure that we are putting in place individualised behaviour support plans that are effective, and using the skill sets that we have. Competency assessment, individually tailored training for education for staff and managers, including on restraint reduction, valid evidence-based risk assessment, positive behaviour support and relevant Commonwealth, state and territory legislative frameworks, including human rights legislation in the Disability Discrimination Act and equivalence and international human rights treaties. So this is just about making sure that everybody has the greatest level of education and information possible in the areas that are really relevant to reducing restrictive practices and getting us on the path that will lead to that reduction. Disability service providers implement guidelines, processes and protocols for staff and managers that are informed by evidence-based best practice, and debriefing and support, continuous improvement for staff at all levels. So making sure that we are doing a really great job of debriefing with everyone, and that we are continuing to stay engaged with what science is telling us is the best way to go about managing instances of behaviour that in the past have resulted in the use of restrictive practices. And so here we've got a little bit of time to talk about the use of restraint and seclusion reduction tools, which is the next of the principles that are working under, and the idea that we need to use evidence-based tools to assist in the prevention of seclusion and restraint, and the use of these in individualized ways. So that recognition that no two people are the same, that there is no cookie cutter approach that we can apply, that we need to be looking at the individual and their skill set and tailoring the tools and the assessments that we're using and the procedures that we're putting in place to those individuals. So understanding, gathering and using tools to assess the future likelihood of aggressive and unsafe behaviours, understanding the function of those behaviours, understanding the common antecedents for those behaviours and the environments that they are likely to come up in, so that we can be proactive about putting into play as much environmental arrangement as possible, having emergency management plans and having everybody know what's in those emergency management plans so that we can be as effective as possible in instances where everything goes wrong. Understanding and employing environmental manipulations and management plans, so setting ourselves up for success proactively and setting that individual up for success proactively. And increased access to meaningful activities aimed at the lifestyle improvement and increased engagement for those individuals. So making sure that we're providing those opportunities that are meaningful for the person that we're working with. And the key implementation areas here are practice guides and reference material and reduction tools and processes for staff and managers, and integration with service provider, staffing and management systems. And following on this, there is the final of the 6 principles, which is around debriefing and practice review. And so recognizing that idea that regular review of practices and plans needs to happen, and it needs to happen regularly to make sure that we are really actively identifying those areas that need improvement, and the things that are going wrong, and the areas that we can expand our skill set in to really make a difference to how frequently these things come up in the future. And there are 2 types of debriefing that should occur. One that immediately follows the event, so in the hours following, that ensure the safety of everybody involved, particularly the individual, but also those people that are working with the individual. And that ensures that effective data collection has been done around that instance, and that any reports that need to be submitted are submitted, that any information that needs to be gathered is gathered while everything is fresh, so that we can be as accurate as possible. And then a second level of debriefing should occur in the days that follow that event, that should include everybody involved, that reviews the effectiveness of the plan, whether things went the way that they were supposed to, and that allows time for reflection from the individual and their support network around the acceptability of the plan and whether they felt comfortable with the way that things went during that de-escalation process. And that's the end of our chat about the National Framework. Thanks for listening.